Now, and then, yeah.
And roll everyone in now.
I am blind and I cannot see. You out there, you're painted evil. Don't bother me. Playing on the clothes you wear, laughing down at me, but I don't care. Right on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Acting for Change, Creating Justice, a Shmita-inspired speaker series hosted by Ekar Farm here in Denver, Colorado. This is part 4 in a 6-part series exploring the connections between the ancient Jewish agricultural technology of Shmita and contemporary movements for justice and liberation. And specifically want to welcome members of the Rhythms for Change cohort here in Denver, as well as the group in Ann Arbor, Michigan, organized by the Alliance for Earth and Land Justice, as well as anybody else who's found their way to this call, or if you're listening afterwards to this recording. Thank you all for joining us and for your commitment to this wonderful topic. Also want to appreciate our technical partners at Mazon. They are running our live recording as well as turning it into the audio of a podcast, which you can find at the Joffe Space Podcast. That's Jofee. You can also find a recording of this conversation at ekarfarm.org/Shmita, as well as a ton of resources and discussion questions related to our conversation today. A couple tech requests. If you are joining us live today, please keep your screen on if you can so we can see your lovely faces. Feel free to put your name and location in the chat so we know who you are and where you're coming from. Probably you'll want to keep yourself muted throughout our conversation today. We will have some opportunities to hear from you. We would love to hear your questions as we get into this conversation here in about 5 minutes. But our request is that you put those questions in the chat window, and we will be monitoring those and making sure that as many of them as possible get addressed. Okay, so with those logistics out of the way, I want to just open us up with a couple blessings and visualizations. Then I'll introduce our guests and hand it over to my co-host, Hannah Perez-Postman, and she will be leading the conversation itself. But first, I want to invite us all to just take a moment, ground ourselves, if that means closing your eyes, if that means looking out the window, if you have a window nearby, or maybe just kind of taking a minute to breathe and think about where you are today in the bigger picture, maybe a bigger picture in space or a bigger picture in time. And I'm going to open us up with an acknowledgement of land. This is something that was adapted by Perry Jardine of Pearlstone Retreat Center. And I think it's really wonderful words for our conversation today. We gather virtually today on stolen land, land that belongs to no one, but that was tended lovingly for thousands of years by a multitude of nations, those who we know and those whose names have been lost to history. We did not receive permission to be here, and no amount of words can do justice to the suffering that those nations experienced at the hands of European settlers. We gather here today in the hope, always present, that love can heal, that the traumas of the past and present can yet be overcome with compassionate learning, collaboration, and graceful action. May this humble gathering serve as a small step towards remembering our true place in the dance of life, a small step on our long path back home. And also in recognition today of the many traumas being experienced around the world in places like India, in Brazil, in Israel, Palestine, of course, I just want to share a couple other blessings from Rabbi Erwin Keller, who's based on the East Coast, Sonoma County in California. He shared a whole list of blessings. I'll share it in the chat window that he called blessings during a surge of violence. And I'm just going to share a couple of them. Baruch ha'etzev. Blessed be my sadness, born of pain and grief. May it keep my heart open to all suffering. Barucha halahitut. Blessed be my impatience. May I lift my voice to demand an end to this, now, not waiting until more lives are lost. Barucha hasavlanut. Blessed be my patience. May it make clear things that are not yet clear. May it support me in the slow study of the fears and angers, hopes and traumas that birthed this moment. Okay, thank you all for bearing witness to those words. So as we mentioned at the top, these conversations, this whole series of conversations is rooted in this ancient set of principles, laws called Shmita. Shmita is mentioned several different times in the Torah and in the texts that came after it. And it's about 1 year out of every 7 being a year of rest or literally release. So this week we're focusing on how those laws relate to food and food justice. So we're just going to name one brief quote that comes from the Torah that talks a little bit about how this technology relates to liberation and our relationship between each other and the land. So that text goes, for 6 years, you are to sow your land and gather in its produce, but in the 7th, you are to let it go and to let it be, that the needy of your people may eat, and what remains the wildlife of the field shall eat. Do thus with your vineyard, with your olive grove. Right, so essentially it says for 6 years, you can grow food the way you need to grow food, but every 7 years, you let that field go. You share that food with anybody that needs it, including humans, but also the more than human world. And you do that with all of the different things that you grow. There's also, not in that quote, but in other Shmita texts, they talk about during that 7th year, you're not allowed to buy food or sell food. Anything that you've stockpiled, that you've saved, you have to give away. So all kinds of really radical, innovative, inspiring, and honestly relevant ways of thinking about food that I think our 2 speakers today will have a lot to share about. So our first speaker is Damien Thompson. I'm so glad to be having him on our series. Damien is someone who I've been on this journey with for over a decade now of justice and liberation in our food system. And he's up to so many things that the bio we have on his on the Ekar website is already out of date. He was a professor at Regis University, but he just accepted a new position at the Masters of the Environment program at CU Boulder, as well as being the co-executive director of an incredible nonprofit led by Black and Brown and Indigenous communities called Frontline Farming here in Denver. He is also a permaculture designer, a yoga teacher trainer, a father, a husband, and all kinds of other amazing things. We're also joined today by Paul Sherman. Paul was also in Denver when he got his beginning to food justice and food systems issues. When he was an undergrad at the University of Denver, he founded their chapter of the Food Recovery Network. Today, though, Paul joins us from the East Coast in the Washington, D.C. area as a representative of Mazon, a Jewish response to hunger. And in that role, Paul builds relationships across the East Coast with Jewish community-based organizations, including synagogues and anti-hunger organizations. So really excited to hear Paul's Jewish perspective on these issues and see that in dialogue with what Damien has to share from being on the ground in the fields. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, and she is going to kick things off with our two speakers. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Adam, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Dr. Damien Thompson and Paul Sherman for joining us today on this Sunday. And thanks to everyone who's taking time on this, well, in Colorado, gloomy Sunday morning to join us for this conversation and explore what our food system is like and how Shmita can inform our understanding of it. I would love if everybody could put in the chat where they're coming from this morning and what brings them here. Just, a quick word or two would be great. And yeah, so as Adam shared and as we saw in the slide, Shmita, one of the foundations of Shmita is really this understanding of food and where food comes from and how it is distributed among the people. And Shmita was established because the community, the society at the time, this ancient agricultural Jewish society, saw that there was inequality and inequity in how food was distributed and how land was distributed and who gained money. And so they created the system to prevent the widening of inequities within the society. And it was an attempt to rebalance and make sure that everyone has enough to eat and that debt isn't accrued over such a long period of time. And we're just really excited to see what, if any, this framework and this blueprint has to do with our contemporary food system and how we can be informed by that. And so I'd love to turn to our speakers and maybe starting with Dr. Damien Thompson, hear about your food journey. What is the work that you're doing and what brought you to this work? That journey for you.
Excellent. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Adam, for the introductions. Thanks to everyone for taking the opportunity on this Sunday morning / afternoon, maybe for some of you. So I just wanted to say a little bit about my background, and then I'll turn it over to Paul. I don't want to take too much space. I guess I always kind of start these conversations by saying that obviously I'm the descendant of people who were enslaved and stolen from the continent of Africa, brought to the shores of the United States, born and raised in North Carolina. And I'm also the great-grandson of sharecroppers. And so that's kind of where I really feel like my journey in this conversation begins, recognizing that my great-grandparents both left South Carolina, the Low Country, where the Gullah Geechee people still reside today, moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and one set of great-grandparents, one great-grandfather, after a considerable amount of effort, acquired 100 acres of land. And so that 100 acres of land, the family farm that my grandmother and my mother grew up on. And so for me, it's always interesting having these conversations because of that history, I've never felt a particular disconnection from the land, or should I say that my disconnection from the land is maybe a little bit less deeply rooted than some folks in the United States, only having been a couple of generations removed. And one of the most important things that I got out of that experience, or at least my family's experience, I was a little too young to experience life on the farm in that way, was that my mother always said that we were poor, but we didn't know it. And so there's always been a recognition that I've had that as long as you had access to the land, that you could be material, that you could not have what other people have monetarily, but as long as you have access to the land and as long as you have access to the capacity to be productive, then you're never poor. And so, you know, I think that that's a really important, that's been a message that has perpetuated, that has moved forward with me, you know, throughout my entire journey. And so just to fast forward a little bit, not very far from where Paul is probably sitting in Washington, D.C., I went to American University for my PhD and actually wrote about gentrification, but it was that experience that started me in the conversation around food, right? Really, for the first time as a kid from North Carolina who had always had access to certain things, had always had access to green space, had always had access to certain types of foods, or at least I thought I always had access to certain types of foods, right? And living in a heavily immigrant community, a Black and brown community, and recognizing the lack of access, the purposeful, the created lack of access that Black and brown people, immigrant communities experience around food, those apartheid situations, which we talk about food apartheid a lot with frontline farming. And so I started to think about, like, what's the psychology around not having access to things, right? What does it do to your, not just your body, but also like your psychology, how you think about yourself, how you think about your community. So when I got to Denver, I grew my first, I think it was like my first summer in Denver, 2009. I grew my first garden at the encouragement of a friend, and it just kind of all hit me at once, like all those things, right? Race, socioeconomics, the nature of the city, what we could do to develop in a meaningful and important way for Black and brown people, the communities that we've always existed in, rather than just simply like resorting to gentrifying economic development plans. And so food really became this opportunity for me to investigate many of the different things, from the spiritual to the material, that I've always had concern about and always had interest in, but could never find that one point of convergence. And so food farming became that for me. And so that's a little bit about how I got started in this work. That led me to meeting Adam, to doing some of those very first the program with the high school students, Seed to Seed program at the Grow House, right, when it was in its infancy. And that was really my beginning of being a community teacher. You know, I went on and did my permaculture certification with Adam again, went on to do my advanced permaculture certification, and through different mechanisms that we don't have time to speak about now, actually had the opportunity to become a farmer myself, right? Had the opportunity to start Frontline Farming with my colleague Fatima Imad. And just so we're clear, Frontline Farming is a food justice, farmer and farm worker advocacy organization, right? So we advocate for justice across the food system, not just within the context of farmers or farm owners. So I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that Paul has some space, and then we'll come back around and I'll continue my story. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. That's incredible. I'm excited to dive into some of those threads that you just spun out for us. And Paul, yeah, I would love to hear about your story, where you came from and where you are now, and how it is related to food and Jewish identity, if that, you know, because that's Shmita.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Hannah. And thank you, Damien, for that beautiful intro. I'm really honored to share this space with you, and I'm really inspired by the work that Frontline Farming does. So I'm excited for this conversation. So yeah, a little bit about where the perspective that I'm coming from with this work is, you know, as Adam mentioned, I began to get really deeply involved with food systems issues when I was studying at the University of Denver. And, you know, I had always obviously known about the issue of hunger, and I was fortunate enough not to experience it myself growing up, but, you know, would volunteer at soup kitchens and food banks and things like that. But when I was studying at DU, the thing that really just made me feel like I cannot ignore it anymore was when I learned about it alongside the issue of food waste. And so I had a professor who very aptly taught us about these issues simultaneously alongside one another. We have all of this food that is going to waste, that is completely detrimental to the environment. And meanwhile, we have millions of people in the United States alone that are struggling to feed themselves and their families every single day. And like you said, Hannah, it was really the Jewish values that have been instilled with me my entire life are, I think, sort of that the driving force behind, when I learned about those issues, I really felt like I just could not turn away, and that this was something I needed to get involved in. And so I coordinated an effort between our on-campus dining provider and local nonprofit hunger fighting agencies in Denver to recover surplus food from the dining halls at the end of the day and redistribute it to those organizations. And that was actually when I graduated from DU, what brought me out to the DC area. That organization, Food Recovery Network, is based in this area. So I completed a year-long fellowship with them. And from there, I was really fortunate to find Mazon and tap more directly back into those Jewish values that we're here to talk about. Mazon, a Jewish response to hunger, inspired by Jewish values and ideals. We are an advocacy organization working to end hunger among people of all faiths and backgrounds. And it was really that advocacy piece that spoke to me. I was so inspired by food recovery, by this, the importance of getting people fed today with perfectly good food that, had we not redistributed, these people might not have eaten that day. But I also wanted to dig a little bit deeper into some of the root causes of why people are able to go hungry in the first place, especially when it is not an issue of food shortage. It's a matter of political will, it's a distribution issue. And it is marginalized communities in the United States that are seeing the effects of this, more than anybody else. And I wanted to dig into some of those systemic reasons why people are able to go hungry in the first place. And so while I transitioned from food recovery into that more policy and advocacy path to ending hunger, my core values have stayed the same. And that's that I believe that no one should struggle to feed themselves and their families with dignity. Food is a human right. And I think we have a real ability to create a world in which no one struggles to feed themselves and their families. And so I'll just say one more quick thing, and then we can dig into the conversation. But to go back to those Jewish values that you spoke about, Hannah, there's a quote from Leviticus: "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You should leave them for the poor and the strangers." I think this relates directly to the issue of to Shmita and what in the arc of this whole conversation. And we can talk about some of the modern implications of how we make sure that that food is left for the people who need it most. So I'll stop there, and I'm excited to have this conversation.
Is it okay if I jump in, Hannah, and kind of just keep it going, just to make it feel snappy? There are some important things that Paul mentioned, and I think that, so I did a little poking around about Shmita and just, some of the different articles that have been written about it. And it's interesting that Shmita, we're talking about Shmita and these very material, spiritual kind of like it has material implications, even though it's kind of a spiritual material piece. And we're trying to do this within the context of like white supremacy and capitalism, right? And so it's like so why do we waste so much food? And it's like, well, we have these two kind of competing, not competing values, but these are the values, right, of like this secularized world that we live in. And it was interesting kind of reading about the rabbis kind of like having these contests, like should we observe Shemitah? How should we observe Shemitah? Like, what are the loopholes? Like, how should we loop in the Palestinians? You know, and so there's a lot of really deep conversations, I think, about Shemitah that necessitate us like bringing into the conversation really early, like white supremacy and capitalism, so that we can grapple with those. So I just wanted to add that to what Paul had brought into the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point and something that we're trying to think of as we think of how to contextualize Shemitah in a contemporary society, because those are the foundations of our society in some ways. And so what does it look like? You know, I reading about the way food was aggregated during the Shemitah year, you know, everything in the olive groves, the community would bring it together, the oil would be pressed, and all of that would go into a communal storehouse that would then be redistributed to the community according to their need. But what does that look like? Who's in control of the storehouse in a white supremacist capitalist society? And then who, you know, how is the distribution monitored so that you make sure that the people who need have agency in that, and it's not something out of the control of the will of the people. And like in Shemitah, it's the court that monitors this storehouse, but according to some rabbinical interpretations of what Shemitah means. And so I'm curious, like what is that system now? Who has control of our food distribution now? And what would it look like to really think about what is a communal storehouse of food? You know, how do you, where, and what are the steps, maybe both in your work, Damien, and your work, Paul, in the advocacy and political kind of national level? Like, what are the steps of transitioning from one system to another?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing I'll say is, you know, so at Mazon, like you said, we focus on advocacy. That does include local and state-based advocacy, but largely we're doing federal level advocacy. And I think for me, one of the things we need to be very clear about, if we're going to engage our government, which Mazon's core belief is that the government has a responsibility and the ability to end hunger among people of all faiths and backgrounds. And in order to do that, we need to acknowledge, as you were saying, Damien, that, you know, we hear the term food deserts a lot of the time, but food apartheid is a much more accurate way to describe it, because it's not random that communities of color face structural barriers to accessing healthy food. Their communities often lack access to healthy and nutritious food because, you know, the effects of segregation and redlining make it so that these communities are oversaturated with food that's high in fat and sugar and salt, sold for cheap prices at corner stores and fast food restaurants. That's not accidental. This is very intentional, and we need to be, you know, upfront about that when we are. And Mazon makes an effort to be upfront about that when we are engaging with government leaders, because we can't. This didn't just fall into anybody's laps. This was an intentional effort. So I think, you know, for me, that's one of the first steps to taking action, is acknowledging that.
Yeah, it's a big question. I think that when it comes to the question of transitioning and what are the steps, I kind of, and this is because of recent experiences, I go back to the distinction between equity and equality. Right. And this is the thing, right? Everybody wants everything to be equal because that sounds great, right? Like, it sounds good for things to be equal. It sounds good for things to be equally accessible. But because of the supremacist and capitalist systems, everything's not, right? And so then we need to have this equity framework, which says that some people actually deserve more. Some people don't deserve more. Some people need more because they're so disadvantaged in the first place. So when you have these conversations, people are happy to have conversations about equality because that means that they don't lose, right? And I think it's really important, kind of like a white supremacist framework, to say, like, if you're a century farmer, or whatever they call themselves in Colorado, right? When you have your farm for over 100 years, right? Equality in like, if we're talking about redistributing land, right? Then there's no possible way that you, as a settler farmer in Colorado, are going to feel like equity is fair, right? But equity might be what's necessary, right? Because if we've had people who have been displaced from land experience genocide and massacre, right, then what is the appropriate response, as not that I did the harm, but as a person who belongs to the group that has harmed, right? And so really bringing in equity and recognizing, like, look, like, the system is this way because certain people built the system this way. People are disadvantaged because certain people in the system are built to be disadvantaged, right? And it would be remiss of me, I know you all are all mostly, I would imagine, American Jews, right? But not to acknowledge what's happening right now with Israel and Palestine, right? And saying, like, and it rocks everybody to their core, right? But then, especially, like, if you're a Jewish person living in the United States who has an affinity for Israel because of so many different reasons, right? But then also recognizing, as a person who's really interested in justice, that justice isn't being served, right? And so my challenge here is, like, as these people who are living in the United States, who have connections to this part of the world where, really where atrocious things are happening, how do I think globally in that sense, right? But then act locally in this sense, right? How do I think as an international person, but recognize that I have, like, very specific outlets of power here in the United States in my personal networks? And it really begins with, like, recognizing that equity means that I might have to give something. Like, the transition doesn't happen and everybody remains happy, right? The transition is going to happen and some people are going to be probably pretty pissed off about it. But that doesn't mean that the transition isn't necessary. And that doesn't mean that the transition isn't possible. So I think it's, what I found as a teacher and in, like, doing this work is, like, you have to really throw that challenge down to people and be like, look, you have to change, not just you, but me, right? As a person, I have to change, and I have to really be willing to say, like, these are my values, and I'm going to figure out with other like-minded people how to operationalize these values. So I can get on my soapbox super quick, but it's like that equity piece and really recognizing that, like, it's a personal investment. It's not just systemic change. Because I really love Jiddu Krishnamurti, Indian scholar, and he says that you can't, anytime you try to impose a system on people from the outside, the people will rebel, right? The people will just be like, that's not a system that I created. And it creates, like, problems for us psychologically. And so the systems that we're looking for can't come from government institutions. They have to come from us, right? And that's where an idea, not an idea, I'm having a hard time, a commitment like Shmita or the Jubilee year or the sabbatical year or however you call it, like, that's what they are, is they're direct challenges. They cause us to confront what's wrong outside, but then also what's going on internally with us.
Very powerfully put. Thank you, Damien. Yeah, I think bringing in Israel-Palestine is relevant and necessary, and especially as we think, contemporary young Jews in America, which is the audience that I primarily interact with, as many people are waking up to white supremacy and the roles that we play in it in the United States as Ashkenazi Jews, and what does it mean to stand with Black Lives Matter? What does it mean to be anti-racist in our practice in our lives here? And then extending that to, how do we understand Israel, Palestine, and how do we understand those as part of the same issue? And what is the violence being done in our name on a very direct level? And what does it mean to take tangible action and to engage in uncomfortable conversations that have many layers on top of them? But that is, like, what is our internal obligation and our community obligation? And then also with, I think, with Shmita, it's like, yes, that individual, it's like, what is our individual, when I think about a farmer, like the rules for the individual farmer in Shmita are very specific. You dissolve the borders, you cannot cultivate in your field, and you have to let everyone eat of them. And then also in turn, like like society is ensuring that you have what you need. And so what is it like, what does that balance look like? What does it look like to dissolve our borders, to say we're going to not have control right now over this communal need, this thing that everyone needs access to. And like, in order for everyone to have access, I need to relinquish control and trust that I will have my needs met. And so what are the systems for the people who have access to what they need to trust that if they let go of control, they will still have their needs met? And kind of what are their needs? And I'm curious, Paul, if any of this, how does this show up in the work of Mazon and in your understanding of being a young Jewish person in America doing anti-hunger work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's interesting because Mazon has been around this is actually our 36th, this year is our 36th anniversary. And so Mazon has been around for a lot of, it was founded at a different time. And I think that what it means to be an American Jew has shifted over that time. And the way that we talk about these issues has changed. And I think that, we're trying to be intentional, as I was saying, about acknowledging the detrimental effects of white supremacy. And we can't, I think when Mazon first undertook advocacy, it was a little bit more passive talking about those issues. And I'm pleased to see that, because I've only been with the organization for about 2.5 years, I'm pleased to see that there is a shift happening. And it's fascinating because, a lot of the people who have been supporting Mazon for 36 years, their views and what American Judaism looks like to them is very different than what it looks like to my generation. And, I think that as we saw last summer, I think that, communities are realizing that we can't just not talk about the longstanding effects of racism. And so Mazon is trying to be intentional about what is the role of race in hunger. And, it's not, like I was saying, it's not a coincidence that communities of color and other marginalized communities, that, hunger doesn't look the same for them as it does for other communities. That's very intentional. And so one of the things Mazon does is we prop up, we focus on special populations. We undertake and try to highlight those communities based on what our partners on the ground are saying. So we have grantee partners across the country who are, those are food banks or legal aid societies or other direct service organizations. We specifically fund positions in those organizations to do advocacy. And we hear from those organizations, these are the communities that are coming to us. And so we try to highlight those communities that, whether it's in the anti-hunger community, in the American Jewish community, hunger in those communities is not being talked about. Right now, that includes single mothers, military families and veterans, senior citizens, and specifically LGBTQ senior citizens, and rural and remote populations, such as Native communities and tribal land. And when we talk about food sovereignty, this is where it really gets interesting, because one of the reasons why Mazon believes that SNAP is such an important program, for instance, is because it allows people to feed themselves and their families with dignity, to honor their culture in a way, and purchase food that they might not be able to get from even food recovery from a local food distributor. And so I think I understand that your organization, Damien, actively enrolls people in SNAP. And I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but just from my own research, looking at your website, that is such holy and important work, because I think that it helps us sort of begin to address white supremacy and racism, because it allows people to, really, like I said, feed themselves with dignity. And I think thinking about what that means is a huge part of our reckoning as a community about our role. Like you were saying, Damien, while it's not the individual's fault for what has gone on for the past few hundred years, understanding that, we are the community that has harmed. And Jews understand that so well. And we're talking about it with Israel-Palestine because we have been oppressed. And so what does it mean to start to, think about who is being oppressed now? So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, there's a lot of really deep questions for sure. But thank you, Paul. I was just going to speak to a little bit of that, because Hannah and Adam asked us to speak about food justice, and we hadn't quite gotten there yet necessarily. And so, you all can see this on our website, but the way that Frontline operates is that we kind of, we operate on this spectrum from food access to food sovereignty, right? And so we recognize food access, right? So food access is like, it's acute hunger. So we can't, even though we may have this long vision and this like liberatory vision, we can't necessarily ignore that people are hungry now. So we participate with Denver Food Rescue. We rescue food that we distribute within Denver. I think last year we rescued about 44,000 pounds of food, just Frontline Farming, and distributed that to different communities. We also do a lot of work with SNAP. So those of you who are in Colorado and don't know this, SNAP is actually Coloradoans are under enrolled in SNAP. I think we have like about a 70% SNAP enrollment rate. I think it might actually be a little bit less than that. And so yes, Frontline Farming took it upon ourselves this past year, especially with COVID, to get the training, to hire the right people so that we could start enrolling folks in SNAP. And so just so we're clear, it's not just historic people who historically have been associated with food stamps, right? Like single mothers or POC. We also register farm workers. We also register farmers, because what most people don't know is I think it's about 54% of Colorado farmers make less than $25,000 a year, right? So the majority of farmers in Colorado are actually really poor people, right? Let's get that right. There was so much more I wanted to say. So then food justice then is in the middle. And I think this gets to what Paul was speaking about advocacy, right? So we don't look at food justice as being the pinnacle. We look at food justice as appealing to the systems that currently exist, right? So when you go and you create policy, like we're trying to do with when we advocate for the Farm Workers Bill of Rights, right? It's a recognition that type of work is justice work, because we are dealing with state governments, whether it be on the state level or federal level. And that really is the place where advocacy and where we're going to find this thing called justice, right? But then we also have it move forward. We talk about food sovereignty. And to me, Shmita, the idea of Shmita is about food sovereignty, right? It's about people having control over their resources enough to make a decision on whether or not land lies fallow, and for it not to be a purely economic calculation, because as we all know, as people who live in society, like the world does not just function on economics alone. And we have so many different considerations that we need to make for our fellow people, right? To make sure that they're okay, while at the same time making sure we're okay. So really sovereignty is about creating those systems, to me, that exist outside of the confines of government and that type of interference, which allow us to build true structures that are truly liberatory. And I loved it when Hannah said, what does it look like to dissolve our borders? And to me, you weren't talking about our national borders. You were talking about our individual borders, right? Those borders that exist within us that separate us from other people and cause us to do things like hoard food, or where I'm from in North Carolina, where people were hoarding gasoline. You know what I mean? It's we need to get away from that. And so I really appreciated that comment, because it made me think about our own internal borders. But then also we need to continue to try to move past simply advocating for food justice within the context of government and start to think about how we can build our own systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Damien. And I'm sure you have other other questions, but I wanted to bounce off of something that you said that speaks to exactly why we do the work we do the way that we do it. And sort of tying it back into Judaism, there's charity and there's justice. So if you think about tzedakah versus tzedek, where does the word tzedakah come from? Tzedakah, as we know, is the idea of, it is charity, which is rooted in sort of tikkun olam, repairing the world. And like you said, Damien, exactly what you said, that people who need food need to be fed now. They can't wait for a bill to pass. They can't wait for bureaucracy or for the laws to change. They need to be fed now, which is why food rescue and distribution efforts on the ground are so unbelievably crucial. And we need to sort of address the root causes of why people were hungry in the first place. And SNAP sort of is in the middle of this, because it not only gets people fed, but it also is proven to lift people out of poverty. And we can't rely on that program alone or on government solutions alone to find an end to hunger. Damien is completely right. We need to create our own systems. But yeah, it's this idea of sort of starting to think about that difference between tzedakah and tzedek, or charity and justice. And that's sort of how I approach our work.
Wow. Yes. Thank both of you. And both of you have pulled on these threads of just not that they're in conflict, but that actually we need to be addressing things on multiple levels all of the time. So yes, like we need to be addressing people's immediate hunger needs. And yes, within the systems that we have set up, like what does food justice look like? What does community-led food justice? And also, there's like larger organizational food justice efforts. And then, yeah, what does food sovereignty look like? And how are we building systems that feed all of these and also move us towards the side of food sovereignty, like move us towards kind of emancipation and liberation, so that everyone not only has what they need, but like it is able to create the conditions for the lives that are like lives of dignity and respect, and the lives that they want to live. And so and I think about Shmita, it's interesting, Damien, because I hadn't thought of it. I mean, I've thought about it in the food sovereignty context, but I've always kind of gotten stuck on like who has, like it is a guideline, and I always think of it as food justice because like who, it's like an edict passed down from the religious, like, powers that be that say like, this is, this is what we're doing. This is how the Torah is saying, like, we are adjusting for equity in our society. And, but it is interesting reading the ways that all of these different farmers and like community members buy into Shmita. So it is very much like, and the way it is parceled in different communities. So like different rabbis had different interpretations, and it played out differently. There was not like just one way that it played out in the communities in which it was considered a rule and a guideline. And so, yeah, I'm just curious. I feel like there's some variability, and maybe not just like an umbrella, like this is how society will enact Shmita, but like based on the community that is a part of and the needs of that community, it will be, it will kind of shift in its mission and in its enactment. I also there are a couple of really great questions in the chat, and I just wanted to ask a couple of them as we head into the last 10 minutes of our time. And this was, okay, here's a question from Adele about land use and agricultural land. I think it kind of speaks a little bit to something you shared in your intro, Damien, about land access and what that had to do with the way your understanding, your relationship to food and land was shaped. And so the question is, what about land use and losing agricultural land? Some of the conservancies are looking for farmers to manage older donor farms. Is this something you've looked at?
So this is an awesome question. Is it Edel? Yeah, we actually haven't. So I just wanted, what is the best way to say this? This is interesting in terms of thinking about, again, like white supremacy. I was thinking about it recently, and it is, I think it's almost as if the way that we think about farm inheritance happening through families almost guarantees farm centralization. So this is the thing, we've been doing a lot of work with agricultural workers, with farm workers. And in Colorado, some Colorado rural communities are 25% Latinx, 35% Latinx, right? These are people who come from agricultural regions. They come to the United States to participate in agricultural work. They come back to the United States year in and year out, even though the work is backbreaking and grueling, and they don't have access to so many of the things that we do as workers that we take for granted in various industries. But we've never, and I keep still seeing bills about rural economic development, you know, and how do we save farms? And it's like, you probably figure out a way to save farms if we could cut through some of the racist bullshit and actually start to give this land to Latinx farmers who actually care about the land, who actually have been the stewards of the land, and who have actually been farming the land for, in some cases, generations, right? But we never have that conversation about urban or about rural economic development, because there are some very serious racialized discourses that prevent that from happening. But to me, we have a really easy pathway toward reinvigorating rural communities, because the people who want to do it are already there. The people who are doing the farming are already there. We just pretend like they're not there. We just invisibilize them. And because we invisibilize them, we end up having a really intellectual conversation about land redistribution, when it doesn't have to be an intellectual conversation. And I think that's why I liked the question so much, because it's like, yes, totally. The people who want to do it, the people who are farming, are already there. We just don't have the systematic mechanisms, and we don't have the ideological, fortitude to be able to start thinking about that type of transition. So I really appreciated the question. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think about the origins of kind of the food sovereignty movement and the campesinos in like Central and South America, that was the root of it, was like land access, and like, this is our land. Why is 92% of it owned by people who don't live here? And why do we not have access to the land that we have been living on for so many years? I also had let's see, what time is it? Okay, we've got a little bit of time. Another question in the chat, which is maybe kind of talking about what we were a little bit earlier about, how to work internally and in a subversive way to the systems of white supremacy and capitalism that we are a part of. So, and then also how to work to create systems that are outside of that. And so how to do that balance between working with inside the system and working outside of it, is a question put by Hanok, who's part of our Denver cohort.
Yeah, I think that is such an important question. And for me, just personally speaking, this is something that I sort of struggled with both during my time more directly involved with food recovery and when I transitioned into this role. When we talk about food recovery can only exist if food waste exists. So, when I was partnering with our on-campus dining provider, which was run by Sodexo, a massive corporation, in order for us to have this program, they needed to be wasting food for us to have to recover. So I was constantly struggling with, like, this is a really important solution now to get these people fed, because this food is going to waste. And we also need to talk about pushing these corporations not to waste food in the first place and to be more responsible about food. And that's why it's also so important to connect people to where the food is coming from. Talk about farm to table. People need to have a relationship with the food that they are eating, which in our society, for the most part, we don't. And thinking now in my current role at Mazon, on the one hand, we're absolutely working within the system of our government, because our sort of core belief is that the government, that hunger is an issue of political will, And the government, as I said at the beginning, has both a responsibility and the ability to end hunger in the United States. But that being said, we, as Damien so aptly pointed out, we need to also create our own systems. We can't solely rely on these systems that exist. So it is sort of there's definitely a conflict and a contradiction there. But I think that one of Mazon's main roles is holding the government accountable for the oppressive systems that it has created that allow people to struggle to feed themselves and their families in the wealthiest country on earth.
Yeah, that's really important. And then Paul brought up the idea of contradictions, and I think that it's almost like it's the contradictions in a lot of this work, which is why frontline farming exists. It is to not to take advantage of the contradictions, but to stand in the contradictions and to say, like, these are the important places where we need to be doing this work. And we have I don't want to say grudgingly, like, we recognize so many things that were happening with farm workers, but getting into like the world of policy and like the advocacy has been painful and difficult, right? Because I've been in rooms, and I won't name names, but I really started to recognize over this last year, really, like, that so many of the rooms where white supremacy, like all of these things are perpetuated, like, we're just not in. And I don't mean like we as in like brown or black people, but like many of you either. Like, we're not in those rooms, and the types of political calculations and the types of things that people with a political bent are willing to give away, can be quite shocking. When I was at the state capitol, the other day, and my whole point was like, if you make rules that you as a policy person think are like, well, we got it okay this time, we didn't get it quite right, so we'll do better next time. And I was trying to say that in the meantime, people die, right? Like, that's what that means. Like, when you talk about, like, oh, we're just going to compromise and like it's going to be fine, we'll get it better the next time, and then people die. Kids, farm workers, children die in trailers because their parents weren't home, right? And they can't, there's so many things. Like, farm workers die because they're too exhausted to do their job safely, or because they've never been trained to do their job or to work a piece of machinery effectively, right? Because it's always about like this capitalist intention, like producing the most in the least amount of time with the least amount of pay. And that's been my overwhelming, kind of response to the necessity of doing policy work, is that I don't know how some people do it, because it is deeply painful, and you see a lot of things that are often perpetuated that you personally know are not right, and you as an individual would never stand for, right? In your life, you would never allow people to treat you like this. But then you're in these rooms where it's kind of made to seem like, oh, this is fine, this is okay, this compromise is fine. And so it's that contradiction, and standing in those contradictions, and then be like, no, it's not fine, this is actually white supremacy. Like, I actually had to say that in a meeting. Like, people didn't like it, but it was true. And so, like, needing to stand in those contradictions and then speak, really powerfully, that's been my overwhelming experience, and it's just absolutely exhausting as a Black person. I don't know if it's exhausting for other people. I don't walk in anybody else's shoes, but for me, it's very tiring.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. And some of what you spoke on is about the exhaustion that you experience kind of in the policy realm, and also the exhaustion of the people who, like, farm workers, as you were saying, like the labor laws and the ways that the system is set up is not for necessarily a whole human being to have what they need, and it's food, and it's also rest. And I feel like that's the other, like, another facet of Shmita is like rest and release, like a year of rest for farm workers. There is no cultivating of the land, and everybody has what they need, and the land is allowed to rest as well. And so just this understanding of rest is not a benefit or as like a nice extra thing, but as an essential thing for like human life and respect? And what does it look like so people can rest and know that they have the food that they need and that they don't need to break their backs or neglect their children in order to, participate in the system. We have 0 minutes left, but I would love to, in the end, just hear from both of you. And we're really trying to focus this on this. How does this group, how do these people thinking about this really move towards action? And I think you've brought in a lot of pieces that can inform how people might want to move that. And in some ways, they're like just sitting in the contradiction and where do you go from there? But if you have any last minute thoughts of moving towards action, what that could look like for people in this conversation. And if there's any links, we can add them in the chat and post them on resources later.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to share a few action steps. I mean, I think the first thing, the obvious thing is advocate. And that doesn't necessarily, that can mean, political advocacy and engaging with the government, but also advocacy is really just making your voice heard in any setting. And so Mazon, offers advocacy opportunities, whether that's letter writing campaigns to elected officials and things like that, but also just educational programs, because the first step to advocating is educating and learning about what hunger actually looks like in the United States today. We have a variety of programs that educate about hunger from a Jewish lens. So if you are interested in any of those, you can poke around our website. I sent Hannah and Adam, oh, there you go, some links that are now in the chat. If you have any questions about those, if you are interested in scheduling and planning, an educational program, in any way that would be meaningful to you and your community, please be in touch with me and I'm happy to help you. And yeah, I guess I would just finish, by saying that, I think it's a matter of advocating and making your voice heard in the way that you think is meaningful, and educating those around you about what hunger looks like, because I think for too long, the conversation about hunger in this country has been sort of, well, that's just how hunger just exists. And, we can just have canned food, especially in the Jewish community. We've seen our synagogues and things like that just host food drives, and sort of, not that isn't an important thing to do. As we've said throughout this conversation, people need to be fed now, but we also need to dig deeper. So I'm happy to explore that with all of you and think about how we can do that. And create a world in which no one struggles to do such a basic thing as feed themselves and their families. So, yeah.
Thanks, Paul. I was gonna say, I think I admitted to Hannah and Paul and Adam that this is always the most difficult question. So I can say, you can start certainly by going to our website, frontlinefarming.org, and you can link into our newsletter. We actually do a great job of letting people know what are the issues, what are the topics that we are confronting, whether it be on an advocacy level, whether it be in education, whether it be in food sovereignty, and start to really kind of understand the work and the trajectory of the work that we're doing. We didn't do it in last year. Obviously, we're still in a COVID moment. We're taking volunteers at our farms again. So that's an opportunity to kind of start to engage with frontline farming by coming out to the farms. I mean, of course, we always say we're farmers first. We do all this other stuff, but we do all the other stuff almost so we can farm, kind of in peace. So we enjoy inviting people to the farm to have that type of experience. More broadly, I think what Paul said about advocacy is important. And then I think, all of these international issues, all of these global issues have local manifestations, right? Whether it be through land use, whether it be through taxes, whether it be through education and education policy, whether it be through food policy, hunger, food rescue. And so I would really support or encourage everybody to start that process of thinking about what advocacy around these issues looks like on the local level. There are really like local organizations that are working on so many issues and really kind of starting to connect with them to understand the work that they're doing, especially if their work is led by people who have been victims of whatever that particular, issue is, right? If it's like hunger, then organizations that have been started by people who have experienced hunger, so I mean, I really think it's important to advocate, to follow, right? To put ourselves in the position of humility where we can really follow those folks who have had those experiences, who can start to articulate their own perspective on what changes need to be made. And then also, I think Paul said this also, education. We talked about issues of white supremacy, but that's not typical parlance in every household. That's not something that every white family spends time around the dinner table talking about white supremacy, I would imagine, right? And so that it's the necessity to start to have that recognition. And then you all have been really great about like bringing back in your Jewish heritage and like so many different things that Jewish people have experienced globally, and that's a part of this too. Like, oh, like we've had all these experiences and now we're here and like we have this relative privilege. What does that mean to have relative privilege as people who have been oppressed? Or even for me as a Black man who's cisgendered and heterosexual, like I have power. What does it mean as a person who's oppressed in a certain context to then turn around and use the relative privileges that I have? And so those are the types of things that I grapple with, like in my own movement as a person trying to figure out how to best engage. But I mean, you can talk to Adam. Like I didn't know anything about food, but I was willing to walk in and talk to 10 high school students, and I was reading the night before, and I just like go and read it, and then I'd turn around the next day and I'd teach it, and now I'm able to be in a position like this to speak to you all, with a lot more knowledge and a lot more experience. And so those are the things I would say, and hopefully that can be helpful. But I'm also happy to, I'll put my email in here, and happy to take, questions and things like that. And then I have an email about to go out to Hannah and Adam that they will forward to you about the Farm Worker Bill of Rights. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Paul and Damien, for that beautiful and resourceful conversation, and just so much richness for us to dive into. And we really appreciate you spending time with us today, lending your time and your heart and your thoughts and your expertise to this conversation. And we hope to continue this conversation, and thank you for sharing your contact information. Hopefully some folks will contact you if they have questions about the work that you do, and or things that they can support with. And okay, well, we're a little over time, and so we're just gonna call it an afternoon. And the Rhythms for Change cohort will meet you in our Zoom room. Maybe give an extra 5 minutes. So I would say 11:15. See you there. And for everyone else, have a wonderful Sunday. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Blessings. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much for coming, Damien. It was a pleasure to share the stage with you. So.
Absolutely. You too, Paul. Next time I'm in DC, I'll look you up.
Absolutely. Same to you.
Give me a tour. Okay. Sounds great.
Definitely. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.